They towed my truck 3 times before I realized this wasn't about parking. It was about control, and the moment that clicked, something in me shifted because I wasn't just dealing with a neighborhood rule anymore. I was dealing with someone who thought they owned everything they could see. And the crazy part is, they almost got away with it. I moved into that neighborhood about 5 years ago, just outside a mid-sized city, the kind of place where everything looks like it came out of the same catalog: trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes, sidewalks so clean you'd think they were pressure washed every morning. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels peaceful until you realize it's being enforced. There was an HOA, of course, but when I bought the house, the agent described it as low touch, just basic upkeep rules, nothing invasive, nothing aggressive, and honestly, for the first few months, that seemed true. I kept to myself mostly, worked long days, came home tired, parked my truck right out front. It was a white work truck, nothing fancy, a little scratched up from years on job sites, my company name on the side in faded blue lettering. It wasn't pretty, but it was mine, and more importantly, it was legal, registered, insured, parked on a public-facing street directly in front of my house. No driveway space big enough for it, so the street made sense. Nobody said anything at first. A couple neighbors gave me looks, sure, but nothing direct. Then one morning, I walked outside with my coffee, already halfway thinking about the day ahead, and the truck was gone. Just gone. The space where it had been sitting the night before looked almost too empty, like it had never been there at all. At first, I thought it had been stolen. My heart dropped into my stomach. I even spun around like maybe I'd parked it somewhere else without remembering, which didn't make sense, but your brain does weird things when something disappears like that. I called the police. They ran the plate, asked a few questions, then one of them said, almost casually, "Yeah, it was towed." And I remember just standing there like, towed? By who? For what? I hadn't gotten a ticket, no warning, no notice taped to my door, no email, nothing. So I tracked it down to a tow yard about 20 minutes away, one of those places with chain-link fences and rows of cars that all look equally miserable. The guy behind the counter didn't even look up at first, just asked for my plate number like he'd done it 1,000 times that day. I paid the fee, $280, and asked him who authorized the tow. He shrugged and said, "HOA request." That's when the confusion turned into something else. Not anger yet, but close. I asked what the reason was, and he slid a form across the counter, barely even looking at me. Unauthorized commercial vehicle parked overnight. I remember staring at that line for a second longer than I should have, like maybe if I looked at it hard enough it would make sense, but it didn't. Because I already knew the city ordinance. I checked it when I first moved in just to be safe. Commercial vehicles were allowed on public streets as long as they weren't oversized or blocking access, and mine wasn't. Still, I figured, okay, maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe someone complained. Maybe the HOA just got overzealous. So I brought the truck back, parked it in the exact same spot, went inside, and tried to let it go. 3 days later, it was gone again. That time, I didn't call the police. I didn't even bother pretending it might be something else. I just grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove straight to the tow yard like it was part of my routine now. Paid the fee again, another hit, and asked the same question, but this time I pushed a little harder. Who exactly signed off on this? The guy finally looked up at me and said, "Name on the form says Carl Whitaker." I didn't recognize the name at first, but something about the way he said it, like it was supposed to mean something, stuck with me. I got my truck back, drove home, and that evening I pulled up the HOA board member list online. There it was, Carl Whitaker, HOA president. Retired, according to the little bio. Former regional manager for some logistics company. Lived 3 houses down from me. That's when things started to feel less like a mistake and more like a pattern. I decided to go to the next HOA meeting, which, up until that point, I'd avoided completely. It was held in a small clubhouse near the entrance of the neighborhood, the kind of room with folding chairs and bad lighting, where everything smells faintly like old coffee and carpet cleaner. I showed up early, sat in the back, watched people filter in, couples, retirees, a few younger families, all chatting quietly like it was just another routine gathering. Then Carl walked in. You could tell immediately he was the kind of guy who liked being in charge, not loud about it, not aggressive in an obvious way, but controlled, the kind of control that comes from believing you're the smartest person in the room. He smiled at people, shook hands, nodded like a politician working a small crowd. When the meeting started, I waited. Let them go through their agenda, landscaping updates, budget talk, holiday decorations. All of it felt surreal, like I was sitting in the wrong movie. Then they opened the floor for questions. I stood up, held up a folder I'd brought with me, copies of the city ordinance, photos of where my truck was parked, timestamps, everything. I kept my voice calm, steady. My truck has been towed twice now, I said. Both times authorized by the HOA. I've checked the city regulations, and it's legally parked. So I'd like to understand why this is happening. Carl looked at me, smiled that same polite smile, and said, "We're maintaining the standards of the community." I nodded. Right, but the street is public access. HOA rules don't override city law. There was a pause, just a second, but long enough to feel it. And then he said something that stuck with me. Something that didn't sit right the second it left his mouth. "This is a private community," he said. "Our rules take precedence here." He said it so casually, like it was obvious, like I was the one who didn't understand how things worked. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't going to be a simple conversation, because either he was wrong, or he was counting on me not knowing enough to prove it. And at the time, I hadn't figured out which one it was yet. I walked out of that meeting with this weird mix of frustration and curiosity sitting in my chest. Because the thing about what Carl said, it didn't sound confident. Not really. It sounded rehearsed, like something he'd been saying for a long time and nobody had ever pushed back on it hard enough to make him explain it. And once that thought got in my head, I couldn't shake it. At first, I tried to play it straight. I sent an email to the HOA, laid everything out clearly, cited the city code, attached photos, even asked politely for documentation proving they actually had authority over the street. I kept the tone professional, almost overly respectful, because part of me still thought, maybe this gets resolved the normal way. They responded 2 days later. Short, vague, and completely unhelpful. The HOA operates under established governing documents. Enforcement actions are within our rights. No attachments. No proof. No specifics. Just words. And then, about a week later, my truck disappeared again. This time it wasn't even subtle. It was gone overnight, no notice, no warning, like they wanted me to know exactly who was in control. I remember standing there in the morning, staring at the empty curb, and instead of feeling surprised or even angry, I just felt tired. Not the kind of tired you get from work, but the kind that comes from realizing you're dealing with something stubborn and pointless. That tow cost me more than money. I missed a full job that day, a client I'd been working with for months, and that hit harder than the fee. That's when it stopped being about inconvenience and started being personal. So I stopped arguing, and I started digging. I called the city planning office first, got bounced around a few departments, zoning, infrastructure, permits, until I finally landed on someone who sounded like they actually knew what they were talking about. I explained the situation, gave them the street name, and asked a simple question. Is this road public or private? There was a pause, keyboard typing in the background, and then the guy said, "Huh, that's interesting. Not exactly the answer you want to hear." He explained that the road had been built by the original developer when the neighborhood was first planned. The intention was to transfer it to the city once construction was complete, which is pretty standard. But for some reason, that transfer never happened. Paperwork stalled, ownership never finalized. So who owns it now? I asked. Another pause. More typing. Well, technically, he said, it's still private property. Owned by who? That's the thing, he said. The original development company dissolved years ago. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wall like I was trying to process a joke that didn't land. So, you're telling me the street isn't public, but it's not owned by the HOA either? Correct. Then who's enforcing parking on it? He gave a small chuckle, the kind that says even he knew how ridiculous it sounded. That would be questionable. That word stuck with me. Questionable. Because what Carl had been saying, what the HOA had been doing, suddenly it wasn't just annoying, it was shaky. And shaky things can fall apart. So I kept going. I started pulling property records, digging through old filings, things I'd never thought I'd care about. Late nights at my kitchen table, laptop open, papers scattered everywhere, coffee going cold while I traced ownership trails that felt like they were designed to confuse people on purpose. The original developer had folded. Their assets had been transferred, then transferred again, bundled into something else, then split up. It was like following a paper trail through a maze. But eventually, piece by piece, it started to come together. The road, along with a few other leftover parcels, had ended up in the hands of an investment trust. The kind that buys up forgotten or abandoned infrastructure, sits on it, waits for someone to come knocking. And that's when the idea hit me. Not all at once. Not like some big dramatic moment. More like a quiet thought that slipped in and refused to leave. What if I didn't fight the system? What if I owned it? At first, I laughed it off. It sounded ridiculous. Who buys a street? That's not a normal solution to a parking problem. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense in a strange, almost uncomfortable way. Because if the HOA didn't own the road, and the city didn't own it, then whoever did, made the rules. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw a way to flip the situation completely. So I reached out to the trust. The first conversation was surprisingly straightforward. No emotion, no curiosity about why I wanted it, just numbers, paperwork, process. To them, it was just another asset, something sitting on a spreadsheet that hadn't been touched in years. I made an offer. Not low, not aggressive, just fair. Enough to make it worth their time, but still within reach for me if I stretched a little. It wasn't a small decision. I had to move money around, dip into savings I'd been holding on to for years, delay some plans I'd had. But every time I hesitated, I thought about that empty curb, about the missed job, about Carl standing there smiling like he owned something he didn't. And that pushed me forward. The process took about 2 months. Back and forth paperwork, title verification, legal checks, all the boring parts that make something like this real. And when it finally went through, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no big moment, no celebration, just a document, a signature, and a quiet confirmation. I owned the street. I didn't tell anyone. Not the neighbors, not the HOA, not even the guy at the tow yard. I just waited. And then I parked my truck. Same spot, same position, like nothing had changed. 3 days later, it was gone again. I remember actually smiling when I saw the empty space this time, which probably would have looked insane to anyone watching. Because now, this wasn't frustration anymore. This was confirmation. I drove to the tow yard one more time, paid the fee like I always did, but this time I asked for something different. I need a copy of the authorization form, I said. The guy handed it over without thinking twice. Same name, same signature, same confidence. Carl Whitaker. I took the paper, folded it carefully, and went home. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, but this time the mess of papers looked different. Organized. Intentional. I pulled out the deed, placed it next to the tow authorization, and just looked at them for a while. Then I drafted a letter. Short, direct, no emotion. Attached the deed. Highlighted the ownership line. Included copies of the towing records. And at the bottom, I wrote one sentence. You are authorizing removals from property you do not own. I sent it certified, and then I waited. It didn't take long. My phone rang that evening, and when I saw the number, I already knew who it was. I answered, leaned back in my chair, and said nothing. Carl spoke first. His voice was different. Not confident, not rehearsed, just tight. There's been a misunderstanding, he said. I let that sit for a second. Has there? The street, he continued, is considered community property. I almost laughed, but I kept my voice steady. Community property still has an owner. Silence on the other end. And in that silence, I could feel the shift. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the conversation. That silence stretched just long enough to say everything he wasn't saying out loud. And when Carl finally spoke again, the tone had changed completely, softer, careful, like he was suddenly aware he might have stepped into something he didn't fully understand. What exactly is it you want? He asked, and that question told me more than anything else, because people don't ask that unless they know they've lost leverage. I could have gone a lot of directions in that moment. I could have pushed, demanded money, threatened legal action, made it messy. But honestly, at that point, I didn't want chaos. I wanted clarity. I wanted the nonsense to stop. So I said the simplest thing I could think of. I want the towing to stop. Another pause. Then, of course, he said quickly, almost too quickly, we can resolve this. And for a second, I believed him. Not because I trusted him, but because it would have been the logical move. The easy move. But 3 days later, one of my neighbors knocked on my door. It was Linda, lived across the street, mid-60s, always friendly in that quiet way, the kind of neighbor who waves more than she talks. She looked uncomfortable standing there, like she wasn't sure if she should even be involved. They took it again, she said. I didn't even have to ask what she meant. I stepped outside, looked at the curb, empty. Again. And this time, I didn't feel angry. I felt something colder than that. Because now it wasn't confusion, it wasn't overreach, it was intentional. He knew. He had the paperwork. He had the chance to stop. And he chose not to. So I stopped playing fair. That same afternoon, I went out and bought 2 metal signposts and had custom signs printed. Nothing flashy, just clean, official looking. I installed them myself at both entrances to the street, took my time with it, made sure they were straight, visible, impossible to ignore. Private road. Authorized vehicles only. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed. No HOA branding. No ambiguity. Just fact. Then I went home, sat down, and typed up a simple authorization list. My name at the top. My vehicle. And then, one by one, I added every neighbor on the street that had ever been decent to me. Linda, the couple with the golden retriever, the guy who fixed his own motorcycle on weekends, even people I barely knew but had never caused problems. And then I left out exactly 4 names. Carl, and the 3 board members who'd approved the towing. I printed copies, signed them, dated them, and kept everything documented. If this was going to escalate, I wanted it clean. The next morning, I made a call. Same tow company, same yard. But this time, the conversation was different. I explained the situation, provided proof of ownership, sent over the documentation, the deed, the authorization list, everything. There was a pause on their end, a longer one this time. And then the guy said, "So, you're the property owner now?" "Yeah," I said. Another pause. Then, "All right. We'll need that on file." By the end of the day, they had it. And then I waited. It didn't take long. That weekend, one of the board members, a guy named Eric who drove a black SUV, parked overnight right in front of his house like nothing had changed, like the signs didn't exist, like the rules still bent in his favor. I gave it until morning. Then I made the call. The truck showed up about an hour later. No drama, no yelling, just the quiet efficiency of a job being done. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching as they hooked up his SUV and pulled it away. Eric came running out halfway through, shouting, confused, angry. "Hey, what the hell is this?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move. "Unauthorized vehicle," I said. He stared at me like he was waiting for the punchline. It never came. "You can't do that," he snapped. I took a sip of my coffee. "I can." And that was the moment it really flipped. Not legally, not on paper, but in reality. Because now it wasn't just me reacting anymore. I was setting the terms. They tried again the next day. Another board member. Same result. Tow truck, paperwork, gone. By midweek, the neighborhood felt different. Conversations got quieter when I walked by. People started reading the signs more carefully. And for the first time since I moved in, nobody looked at my truck like it didn't belong there. Then the lawyer got involved. I got a letter, formal, structured, full of legal language that basically boiled down to one thing. They wanted control back. They argued implied authority, community governance, shared access rights. All the usual angles. But here's the problem with that. None of it changed ownership. I responded once. Short, direct. Attached the deed again. Highlighted the same line. No emotion. Just fact. A few days later, there was an emergency HOA meeting. This time, I didn't sit in the back. I walked in, took a seat at the front, and waited. Carl looked different. Not defeated, not exactly, but worn down. Like someone who had been certain of something for so long that they never prepared for the possibility of being wrong. They skipped the usual agenda. Went straight to it. What would it take to resolve this situation? One of them asked. There it was again, that same question. I leaned back slightly, took a breath, and laid it out. I'll sell the street, I said. At market value. Plus reimbursement for every towing fee, legal cost, and lost wages. No anger. No sarcasm. Just numbers. They didn't agree right away. Of course they didn't. There was back and forth, quiet discussions, a few looks in my direction like they were trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I wasn't. Because this had stopped being about the truck a long time ago. This was about accountability. About what happens when someone assumes authority without ever being challenged. It took a couple weeks. Negotiations, paperwork, more legal back and forth. But eventually, they agreed. They paid. The street was transferred to the city within a month. Official this time. No gray area, No missing paperwork. No room for interpretation. New signage went up, clean and standardized. And just like that, everything went back to normal. Except it wasn't really the same. The HOA issued a written apology, refunded every towing fee I'd paid. Even the missed work got compensated. Carl stepped down as president about 2 weeks later. No announcement, no explanation, just gone from the position he'd held on to so tightly. And me? I kept parking my truck in the same spot. But now, nobody said a word. Sometimes I think about how easily this could have gone the other way. How if I hadn't asked that one question, who owns the street, none of this would have happened. I would have just kept paying, kept adjusting, kept letting someone else define what I was allowed to do in front of my own house. And that's the part that sticks with me. Because it wasn't really about the truck. It was about how far people will go when no one pushes back, and how fast things change the moment someone finally does. So here's what I'm curious about. Was I right to take it that far? Or should I have just let it go and kept the peace? Because I can tell you this, it solved the problem, but it definitely didn't make me the most popular guy on the block. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd think. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA or something like this, I'd honestly love to hear how you handled it.